Dr. Brandy Faulkner is the Gloria D. Smith Professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech. Her teaching and research focuses on race and public policy and U.S. constitutional law. Dr. Lucien Holness is an assistant professor of history at Virginia Tech. His research and teaching focuses on African American politics and culture, slavery and emancipation, and the social and political history of early America. Hello and welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wade. This is the podcast where we explore population health issues impacting your community. Dissect and Connect is a service of New River Valley Community Services and the Montgomery County Prevention Partners. So Brandy and Lucien, welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yes, thank you both so much for taking time to join me for this conversation today. We're focusing specifically on Juneteenth. And so for those listening who don't know, what is Juneteenth exactly?
So Juneteenth is the celebration of emancipation among a group of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people in Texas. So it commemorates the arrival of Major General Gordon Granger of the Federal Army, his arrival in Galveston, Texas, where he issued General Order Number 3, enforcing Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So bringing emancipation to enslaved people to Texas when he arrives in Galveston in June of 1865.
Okay. Brandy, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a perfect description. It's so significant in of African American people because if you think about it, you get this big announcement that you're free. And as it turns out, you've been free for a couple of years. So it's very important, I think, to consider the implications of that and why it's such a celebrated event in our community.
Yeah, and so given that it is connected to an event that happened over 150 years ago at this point, why is it still important for us to recognize?
Well, I think we can relate it to the excitement and the celebrations that most Americans have around July 4th, right? That also happened hundreds of years ago,
right.
Yet Americans still celebrate their freedom and their independence on that day. And so it is no different for our community, with this being sort of the official end to slavery. It's a day that I think brings a lot of reflection and a lot of happiness to our community. So that's why it's still celebrated.
Yeah, if I could add to Brandy's point, I think what makes Juneteenth so significant for the African American community and the United States at large is the language in General Order Number 3. It's not just about freedom, but also if you read the language of General Order Number 3, he notes that formerly enslaved people had equality of personal rights and rights of property. So the question is, what are these personal rights? And that's going to be a contested issue after the war. So part of that language in the fulfillment of not just no longer free from slavery, but what do these rights entail, which are going to be contested as part of that meaning, and also the meaning of the Civil War itself. I mean, Juneteenth commemorations surrounding Juneteenth, early commemorations surrounding Juneteenth are not just celebrations of freedom, but narratives about the meaning of the Civil War. What does it mean? Putting the issue of slavery at the center amongst a white population in Texas of ex-Confederates who don't want to recognize slavery as the cause of the Civil War and want to negate that. And also, too, its political meaning. I think Mike, maybe you'll have more questions about the political importance of Juneteenth, because it's more than just a celebration. But, I mean, it's political about what it represents, not just the ending of slavery, but also this holiday for African Americans to celebrate, this idea of rest from work in a society where former enslavers now, at the end of the Civil War, want to control Black labor. And so, I mean, there's something very political about this idea of taking rest from work, about seizing control of one's labor and one's time.
Well, since you touched upon it, Lucien, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the political implications an aspect of Juneteenth and what that means fast forwarding to today?
Yeah, so Juneteenth as a holiday, I mean, in the early years of emancipation, it's a very subversive holiday depending on where you're at in Texas. I mean, there's a lot of anger and confusion among former ex-Confederates in Texas. Many of them claim that they weren't defeated. And I mean, technically that is true. I mean, militarily, at the Battle of Palmito Ranch in May of 1865, that is a Confederate victory, long after Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered in April of 1865. So there's a narrative among ex-Confederates and whites that they were never defeated in the Civil War. So this unwillingness to let go. And so African Americans create their own counter narrative that notes, they're defeated, and to try and celebrate this holiday, there's a huge risk to celebrate this holiday in certain areas of Texas where formerly enslaved people could experience outright violence. I mean, in some of these areas of Texas, formerly enslaved people or enslaved people in the early years of emancipation face huge violence from local whites who are still angry about their defeat, which they were defeated. The Confederacy is no more. And I mean, to celebrate Juneteenth in some of these areas of Texas, in these early years of emancipation, they face real risk of violence in portions of Texas. I just want to add too, but I mean, African Americans are determined to celebrate this holiday in the face of early intimidation and anger from whites to celebrate this holiday. And initially, it starts off in Black churches, major community institutions and political institutions.
So, for those of us who aren't African American or part of the Black community, is it appropriate for us to celebrate or recognize Juneteenth?
Sure, I don't think there is any problem with that, and I think that everybody has to figure out what values they hold and what they wish to celebrate. But that's true with any holiday, right? There are some that we choose not to participate in, and some that we choose to participate in rather frequently. So we do see across communities many people who are engaged with Juneteenth. Certainly for those who are outside of the Black community, we don't see as much engagement and celebration, but that may be changing a little bit as more people learn about Juneteenth and its significance. But yes, I certainly see no problem with anyone celebrating this very important day.
So what's the best way for us to do that if we're not a part of the Black community?
I think that it's up to you to make that determination, right? Because celebrations look so differently depending on the community, right? So even within the African American community more generally, there are some areas that have rather large scale parades, right? And it is actually a multi-day event in some communities. Others have a more subtle and reflective approach to celebrating. So what that looks like for you is something that you would have to determine. But most of the events that have already been planned, I should say, are typically publicized quite widely across communities. So there's no reason why you can't look at some of those and take part in some of those, and also maybe get some ideas for other events that you'd like to plan.
And I would think that if nothing else, just educating yourself about Juneteenth, the history, the significance of the day and the celebration would be a good starting point. Fair?
I would agree.
So Juneteenth is recognized as an official holiday in some states, but not all. So Lucien, I'll ask you, should it be a federal holiday?
That is a great question. So, because I'm actually from Pennsylvania, so, culturally I don't really have ties to Juneteenth. It starts off as a holiday for, Black Texans. So,
right.
It originates there. But I guess if our purpose for this holiday is to commemorate, putting slavery at the center of our narrative of the Civil War and trying to understand the meaning of the Civil War itself and those issues surrounding Juneteenth, like those debates that emancipation opens up, like questions about what are rights, and also these public celebrations. I'm more than open to a national holiday. For me, being from Pennsylvania and a historian, emancipation comes. Emancipation is not one moment. It's not one moment in time, but there are several moments of emancipation. Personally, I'm for more holidays, the better. Being a Pennsylvanian, for us, slavery gets abolished, well, not abolished, but gradually on the path to extinction on March 1st of 1780. So as a Pennsylvanian, I would love for us to have a holiday on Abolition Day, like March 1st of 1780. Mm-hmm. But no, I have no problem with a national holiday. I would like to see a national holiday, what Juneteenth represents, like the values of Juneteenth. Because in essence, too, Juneteenth is also a celebration of Black accomplishment, not just for not just for freedom, not just this commemoration of freedom, but there's a lot of institution building around Juneteenth and a lot of success. I mean, to give you one example, Houston's Black community in the 1870s pooled their resources to build a park for the express celebration of Juneteenth, of emancipation. It's called Emancipation Park in Houston. So I think Juneteenth the ideas surrounding Juneteenth are worthy of a national holiday, in my opinion.
Brandy, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess whenever you can formalize these types of holidays, it's great. But I also want to note that communities have been celebrating Juneteenth for so long across many states, even in states where the holiday itself wasn't an official holiday. There have been many states since the 1990s that did actually observe the holiday, right? So we've had governors issue statements and state legislatures passing resolutions, even when they weren't formal laws, to recognize the significance of this holiday. So we've already seen it happen across so many states. And I think certainly a federal holiday would be the next step. But even if it's not declared a federal holiday, I don't think it minimizes in any way the significance of that day for so many people in our community. It's more so a formal recognition, which some people prefer. But given the idea of self-determination, right, that is certainly part of the political values of Juneteenth, I think it's important to keep the emphasis on the community aspect of the holiday and not so much always the formal declarations of what it is and what it means.
In the context of what's happening in our society today, is there a heightened level of importance around recognizing and celebrating Juneteenth?
Well, it's interesting to consider, and it's such a great question. I did notice last year when we were in the midst of a red summer that had come as a culmination of so many violent police attacks against the community. Many were looking for some unifying events to really bring the community together for something other than grieving. And as those discussions were taking place, many people did start to rethink Juneteenth and its significance and its importance. And what I also observed was that many people outside of the Black community were also investigating Juneteenth and trying to figure out what it meant and why it was important to Black people, somewhat as an educational process, as there were many topics that people were investigating, but also as a way of figuring out how they could be supportive. So I don't know that will continue, maybe. Mm-hmm. But I did see an increase in interest and locally even in the number of celebrations last year. Maybe that will happen this year as well.
Yeah, and can I build on Brandy's great points?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I noticed an uptick of interest too. And in addition to the violence, the protest against police violence over the summer, but also in the context, I wonder if this has anything to do with it, but also in the context of us rethinking the presence of Confederate monuments and memorials and this debate over what is worthy of commemoration, like what gets commemorated and who struggles to get commemorated. So how Juneteenth enters into those conversations about memorialization and honoring these significant events. What events get honored and commemorated, as well as individuals?
Let's talk about the broader issue of racism. So 150 years ago, give or take a few, slavery is abolished. And 12, 13 years ago, we actually elect a black man to be president of the United States. I'm sure there was a point where many felt like we had conquered racism, for lack of a better term, at least on some level. Fast forward to today, and that doesn't appear to be the case, clearly. How would you describe the state of race relations in the United States in 2021?
Well, I'll offer my thoughts on that. I think, Mike, that we have such a broad scope of understandings of what racism is, and that makes that conversation quite difficult, right? So I think you're absolutely right that some people, especially after the election of Barack Obama, really believed that we had gone post-racial, as it was termed in a lot of the popular discourse, and that racism was actually a thing of the past, right? And so I think we have to think about what was it about the election of a man who identifies as Black being elected to the U.S. presidency? What did people internalize about that connection to racism? And then once the backlash started, and it started immediately, how do we make sense of that? If we are in a post-racial society, if it's true that we have gotten past racism, how do we make sense of a lot of the backlash against the presidency of Barack Obama? And what I think it made a lot of people do is really consider the ways in which racism takes place in society. It's not just what we think and what we believe and our individual actions and who I like and who I don't like. It is a whole system of interconnected institutions that serve to preserve a race-based hierarchy. And that hierarchy of value places white at the top and all other classifications beneath it. And that is what we have yet to fundamentally deal with in this country. So even as people celebrate individual actions, individual achievements, it doesn't signal the end of racism. We still have a whole history of events to reckon with. We still have a lot of institutional problems that we have not reckoned with. And while we can say we are certainly not in the same place as we were back in 1865, we still aren't in a place where racism isn't a thing. So it at minimum, I think, forces people to think about what racism actually is and their role in it.
I don't think I have much to add to that, except I guess the election of Barack Obama and the events that transpired around his presidency forced us to look more critically about the structures of race, but as a historian, the historical narratives surrounding race, those events. Like for me, because I was still in graduate school, the shooting at the church in South Carolina, the AME church in South Carolina, for me was an important event. This idea, because that could have been, my grandmother or my mother, this idea of this white supremacist walking into a Black church, murdering these parishioners, the formation of the Black Lives Movement under a Black president. I mean, it gets us to think more critically about maybe racial progress is more than just black faces in high places, but more structurally. We need to look at the structures and institutions that perpetuate racism and this hierarchy, this racial hierarchy. So I would say, a couple steps forward, but a couple steps back. I mean, you have the election of a black president, but maybe one step forward and two steps back. Because, how do you explain this backlash then with the election in 2016 of Donald Trump, who uses these racist narratives? Calling out the nationality. He built his political career calling out, questioning whether Barack Obama is a citizen of the United States. That could be any black person. There are different moments in history about when African Americans' nationality and their loyalty is being questioned. So I would say in terms of race relations, maybe, there are areas of progress, some steps forward, but a couple steps back, as we saw in the Obama presidency.
I understand that you all are involved with a research project at Virginia Tech around Juneteenth. I was wondering if you might be willing to share a little bit about that.
So last summer, our dean, Laura Belmonte, tried to figure out ways to center the scholarship of some of the underrepresented faculty across the college departments and set up the Juneteenth Scholars Program to accomplish that. It was a way to support the work that was already being done, as well as to encourage other scholars to engage in some of this work. And so each of those who were selected for the initial cohort sent in a proposal to talk about how the values, the history, the acknowledgement of Juneteenth was connected to our work. And then those proposals were reviewed and the initial cohort selected, and there has been a second cohort chosen, and so it looks like the program will continue for a while.
For folks who are listening that are interested in learning more about Juneteenth, do you have any suggested resources or sources of information where they might be able to draw from?
Yeah, I know Annette Gordon-Reed, a historian. She has a fabulous, it's a short book on Juneteenth, just a quick overview, and she's looking at, because she's a Texan herself, she looks at the history of Juneteenth through the lens of biography, through her own life story, and also the historical context of Juneteenth. So I think that presents a wonderful overview of not just the holiday of Juneteenth, but the history surrounding to help us better understand what Juneteenth means and what it means to African Americans.
Okay, great. Brandy?
And I'm a fan of community-based knowledge and sharing. So I would highly recommend taking a look at the organizations that already exist in your community, see what they're doing around Juneteenth, and tap into that. Ask questions. That's why they're there. Talk to them about their work and what they're doing around this celebration. And it's a good way, I think, to get out there and make some connections, meet some people maybe that you haven't met, and get a view of how these kinds of holidays and events actually connect to people's lives, right? Certainly the scholarship, the writing is so important as we try to figure out, as Dr. Holness has said, what these narratives look like and what the history itself looks like. But there's something to be said for lived experiences and connections to lived experiences and community building. So that's what I would recommend as well.
Well said. Any final words of wisdom or thoughts to share with our listeners?
That's a lot that could be said. It's a lot that could be said. But Mike, I think with your great questions, I think we covered main themes. So I have nothing else to add because you're great questions.
So thank you both so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike.
Absolutely. Always happy to see you.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dissect and Connect podcast. To learn more about Montgomery County Prevention Partners or New River Valley Community Services, be sure to check us out on Facebook or visit nrvcs.org/podcast.